The journey to the Navy's iconic F-14 Tomcat was one of the most torturous procurement processes of the Cold War. It would ultimately take the US Navy 4 discrete projects and 15 years to go from initial requirement to an in-service fighter. And even then, the finished article was arguably not achieved until the F-14B entered service in 1987. Having covered other parts of the story in prior videos, in this one I want to focus on VFAX and VFX. The latter finally gave the Navy the fleet defender that it wanted. As a reminder, in the late 1950s, the US Navy briefly looked at acquiring what they called a patrol fighter. This was a large, slow aircraft that could loiter 150 miles or so from the carrier and was armed with a battery of large, very long-ranged air-to-air missiles able to hit Soviet bombers before they could launch their own cruise missiles. Douglas won that competition. The aircraft was called the Missileer. It was armed with Bendix Eagle missiles guided by an exceptionally powerful intercept radar and a computer able to coordinate multiple simultaneous engagements against 6 targets. This project was cancelled in December 1960 over concerns about the survivability of the platform. Concepts from the Missileer then found their way into the TFX, a joint project with the TAC and SAC that resulted in the F-111A, FB-111, and the Navy's carrier-capable F-111B. The Navy didn't much like TFX from the start. It wasn't a Navy project, and buying it risked their autonomy. Although it is true that the F-111B was a relatively large aircraft, and with hindsight it lacked the BFM capabilities that the Navy needed in the real world, it was far from a bad plane and would have been effective as a fleet interceptor. F-111B was cancelled in 1968 on the basis that an all-round air superiority fighter with long-range interception capabilities would better fit the Navy's needs in the 1970s and 80s. The question that remained was the exact identity of that aircraft. The Navy was, of course, not without ideas. The aviation branch of the service had never really wanted the F-111B, but they had towed the political line even as F-4B crews encountering MiG-17s in Vietnam exposed some of the weaknesses in the specification of the F-111B. F-111B was intended for very high speed and long loiter time. To that end, it took off with 23,000 pounds of internal fuel versus 16,000 for the eventual F-14, and it was also capable of dash speeds well beyond Mach 2. NATOP's guidelines topped the F-14 out at just shy of Mach 1.9. Variable geometry allowed such a large, heavy aircraft to be very handy behind the ship, but it couldn't defy physics. Aerodynamically, the F-111's large fuselage blanked the tail at angles of attack beyond 20 degrees, limiting angle of attack and thus ability to point the nose in a turning fight. That weakness was compounded by the intake shape and TF-30 combination. Stalls at high angle of attack were a feature. Thrust to weight was worse than the F-4J. Essentially, the F-111 had limited ability to take on other fighters in a close fight. When the F-111A was matched against the MiG-21 during Have Donut in 1968, the conclusion was that it was less able to defend itself than the F-105. The Navy concluded that another aircraft would be required to operate alongside the F-111 as a strike escort, air superiority fighter, and fighter bomber as early as 1965. This aircraft would have Sparrow as a primary armament rather than Phoenix, be a better fighter than the F-4, and a better attack aircraft than the Corsair. VFAX is often solely associated with Grumman, who were contracted in the fall of 1967 to develop a fighter carrying Sparrow, Sidewinder, and a gun. Conceptually, this project was to explore new ways of integrating many of the avionics and all of the lessons from the F-111B into a new airframe. But although it might be technically correct that VFAX was the initiative with Grumman, there were 2 other companies tasked with developing analogous designs for the Navy at this time. Although they were the last to start working on a VFAX-type aircraft, McDonnell were the first to receive a paid contract. In the spring of 1966, they sketched designs for a variable sweep version of the F-4J known as the F-4VSS, initially as a private venture. This idea added a high position variable geometry wing with a span that varied between 55 feet at slow speed, swept forward to 19 degrees, and 38 when fully back for speed. The regular Phantom had a span slightly over 38 feet with its fixed wings. The wings had hinged leading edge flaps and trailing edge full spanned ailerons and spoilers. The Phantom's undercarriage was redesigned and the characteristic Phantom tail anhedral was eliminated. The VS raised the Phantom's gross weight from £46,000 to £51,000, while adding 10% more internal fuel. Maximum speed and ceiling were unchanged, but loiter time increased from 2.5 hours with tanks to 5 hours. In August 1966, McDonnell had supposedly offered an in-service date of early 1970 if the Navy gave the go-ahead by the 1st of January 1967. This led to funding for further development, but although the study was undoubtedly interesting, the Navy seems to have regarded it as an intellectual exercise rather than a serious proposal. McDonnell did offer the aircraft to the Fleet Air Arm, given that service's preference for intellectual exercises over actual aircraft during this period, but the offer didn't go anywhere. Perhaps surprisingly, given that they were the contractor for the F-111B, Grumman were the most advanced in their efforts to develop a follow-on fighter. Having been badly burned by the Jaguar experience and the rejection of the Tiger, it seems that they wanted to be ahead of the game next time. As early as 1961, they had begun a study called G303 that resulted in literally hundreds of concepts for a fleet defense fighter. By 1966, these ideas had largely filtered down to two variable geometry fighters with shoulder-mounted wings, twin engines and twin tails called G303B and G303C. These concepts had relatively narrow fuselages and prominent boxy air intakes featuring an aggressive swept leading edge. But you can still see the family resemblance to the ultimate F-14 in these early studies. There was also a parallel track for a time called 303D that moved the wing into a low position. Aerodynamic calculations suggested that the performance of this concept would be inferior to the high-mounted wing, and it was therefore abandoned. It exhibited poor subsonic longitudinal stability, used excessive amounts of fuel when cruising, and suffered from reduced afterburner performance. Creating an intake in the low-mounted position that could alleviate those issues meant mounting it sufficiently far forward that it obscured the view from the cockpit. It also required using variable intake geometries. Given the challenges the F-111 already faced with this kind of system, it didn't seem like a goer. In the spring and summer of 1967, Grumman and the Navy entered into more serious discussions about a companion to the F-111. The study resulted in an aircraft somewhere between 303B and D. It had a mid-mounted wing resting on pronounced engine pods. Interestingly, the twin tail had been replaced by a single despite the learnings from F-111B. As with the other designs, 6 missiles were carried between the engines. Phoenixes were usually drawn on the sketches, even though Sparrows appeared on the scale models and were in the specification. LTV, which made the Corsair II, rounded out the Navy's VFAX study partners. Although their most recent product was very definitely intended for air-to-ground work, Vought also had great experience in carrier fighters. Their Crusader was statistically the most effective air-to-air fighter the US had during Rolling Thunder, although that was as much about the training of the pilots as the capability of the aircraft. LTV's work on a Crusader follow-up began in July 1965, and by November had solidified into the V484. Predictably, because this is Vought, the 484 featured a more radical wing configuration than either F4VS or the Grumman 303. When fully swept back, Vaught's design had a leading edge angle of 75 degrees, which could be moved even further back for hangar storage. At the 84-degree storage angle, span was only 26 feet, which was 12 feet narrower than the F4 and nearly 14 feet narrower than the 303. Vaught's intention was to move past the troublesome TF30 and fit an advanced 27,450-pound forced turbofan from either GE or Pratt & Whitney. 484's combat weight was optimistically calculated as just shy of 40,000 pounds, although lugging 13,000 pounds of fuel and a full load of 20 Mark 82 bombs, it would tip the scale at over 55,000 pounds. The air-to-air configuration was a combination of up to 8 Sparrows and Sidewinders. As with the Grumman 303, V484 went through numerous iterations, most notably experimentation with single and twin-tail designs. A single tail appears to have won out, as the V505 that followed the 484 from October 1967 used this configuration. In fact, 505 was very much an evolution of that project, as you can hopefully see in this comparison. The 505 was a little larger and significantly heavier at combat weight, partly as a result of carrying 18,000 pounds of fuel. Although LTV clearly saw this as a multi-role aircraft, as you can see from these explainers of potential weapons loads, Phoenix now seems to have been touted as a weapons option, which goes some way to explaining the weight increase. Phoenix means Org 9 after all, and a 36-inch dish in the nose. TF-30s now make an appearance in the design as well. All of this, and the fact that the original blueprints for these designs have VFAX written all over them, strongly suggests that although Grumman might have been ahead on the program, they were not the only game in town. Putting the designs next to each other reveals the advantages that Grumman did enjoy from the early start and the F-111 experience. Hindsight certainly plays a role. We're used to the F-14. But at this stage, you can see how the intake position and the shape is more resolved. The V505 does have the same very sharply raked intakes, but they are thrust further forward and mounted in a manner more like a Century series aircraft. The narrowly spaced engines both reduce the high altitude lift that can be generated by the fuselage and complicate the carriage options for the missiles. The fuselage design also fares in the cockpit, reducing visibility aft. 303 has a raised bubble, already appearing to learn lessons from early Vietnam experience. Interestingly, the very large single tail looks to be better sized than the 303's, but that's the only aspect of the aerodynamic package that appears better resolved. In September 1967, the VFAX exercise concluded with no aircraft being ordered. At this time, the F-111B program was in serious trouble. Despite effective action to save weight, it was still regarded by the Navy as too heavy to safely come aboard ship. As a result, the attack requirements in VFAX were dropped, and a more air superiority focused brief went into development, called VFX. By the time that the F-111B was cancelled in May 1968, the Navy was essentially ready to go with a new set of requirements. These were, in order, a two-man crew in tandem seats. Given the rapid pace of development of ECM, the great ranges covered by the VFX's radar, and the number of tasks that they would need to execute in order to deal with a wave attack, two crew was seen as essential, despite automation advances. Two engines were required for operational safety. Initially, TF-30s would be used as development was largely complete. Primary armament was to be the Org 9 and Phoenix combination. The design should be able to carry 6 of these, or 6 Sparrows and up to 4 Sidewinders, in addition to an internal M61 Vulcan. The aircraft was to be an excellent within visual range fighter, significantly superior to the F-4J Phantom, and able to exceed the anticipated performance of the Soviet MiG-25, which had recently been seen for the first time. We obviously know the truth about the Fox-Bat's abilities now, but like the Air Force, the Navy was planning for a superfighter. As an interceptor, it should be able to patrol for up to 2 hours at 150 to 200 miles from the carrier. And of course, the aircraft should be comfortably carrier capable. At the early stage, the intention was for VFX to be operated from the remaining updated Essex-class carriers. Although the Navy would have preferred to simply have Grumman develop the aircraft immediately, Congress insisted on a fair competition. VFX requirements were therefore published on the 21st of June 1968. On July 27th, 5 companies were issued with the development contracts. Before going through their designs one by one, there are a couple of other process points that arose during the hiatus between VFAX concluding and VFX requirements being issued that are worth just talking about. As you'll see, the VFX designs lack a bit of variety. That is partly due to a November 1967 briefing that NASA gave the Navy on its technical requirements for the USAF's proposed FX Advanced Tactical Fighter. The NASA configuration employed a variable geometry wing with a transonic aerofoil and twin tail booms. It would have had a high lift capability at altitude. As I understand it, they also briefed all of the US aircraft companies on their findings, leading to 4 of the 5 bidders going with this type of design. The second intervention was from Grumman. To speed service entry and reduce both development cost and time, Grumman proposed splitting VFX into 2 stages. VFX 1 would use the TF-30, and then VFX 2 would switch to a more powerful, responsive, and reliable engine when that became available. The Navy therefore asked potential suppliers to price for 50 to 100 VFX 1 aircraft, and then VFX 2 was intended to be the more numerous version, with the Navy indicating it would order at least 350 to 400 of them. In the event, developing the new engine proved a lot harder than expected, and it would be the late 1980s before VFX 2 arrived. The TF-30 powered VFX version was therefore thus the most numerous US type by a long way. With the competition now formally underway, Grumman found themselves in an interesting position. On one hand, they had entered the process possessing the Navy's favoured design and the basis for the requirements. They had also been directly involved in more variable geometry aircraft projects than the other bidders. On the other hand, their competition were no mugs. 2 of them, McDonnell and LTV, manufactured the Navy's existing air superiority and interceptor aircraft in the Phantom and the Crusader. General Dynamics made the F-111 and therefore arguably knew more than most about the perils of the swing wing. North American Rockwell were probably the clear underdogs. Although their aircraft had scored more air-to-air kills than any other US jet fighter to this point, they were largely out of the fighter game. The last F-100 Super Sabre and FJ-4 Furies had been delivered in the late 1950s. Grumman had continued to develop 30360 into 303E, which emerged from the development process at about the same time as the VFX requirement was locked down. It retained the podded engine layout, which simplified maintenance and crucially made it easier to use the engine tunnels for more powerful motors even when they became available. Grumman also flirted with a fixed-wing aircraft called 303F, but this needed such a large wing area to give the required low-speed handling that it then became too heavy and unwieldy to get aboard ship. It also needed a boundary layer control system, an F-111 feature that had given trouble for that program. One useful feature of the F would be the twin tails, which would ultimately be required when the single-tail 303 was selected to become the YF-14. Grumman also produced the 303G, which was an E without Orgnine and Phoenix. They were essentially testing out the degree to which the VFX was dependent on that combination for its combat power, but it transpired that switching to the Org-10 and Sparrow combination only saved about £1,700 at the cost of greatly reduced capabilities. 303E therefore went forward as Grumman's entry for TFX. As submitted, it had the 2 widely spaced engines. The wing pivot mechanism was between the inlet boxes. A large aerofoil-shaped rear section was aft of the pivot. A circular cross-section nose section was ahead of it. The large belly area offered space for 4 Phoenixes to be carried in an aerodynamic fashion. More importantly, it also generated as much as 60% of the aircraft's lift. An M61 Vulcan cannon with 950 rounds was installed in the lower port side of the forward fuselage. Based on NASA research, the horizontal tail surfaces were located as low down as possible relative to the wing level. That enabled an oversweep of the wings over the tail. At this setting, the leading edge sweep was 72 degrees, although this didn't carry forward to the eventual F-14. Wings were large in order to give agility in close fighting. An extendable glove vane deployed above Mach 1 to destabilize air over the wings and therefore increase high-speed maneuverability with the wings back. Grumman chose to use a single large vertical tail fin in order to reduce weight and because it was judged to give better performance at high angles of attack. A ventral strake beneath the fuselage provided directional stability in the event of an engine shutdown at high speed. Empty weight was estimated at £35,300. Design takeoff weight was 52,700. G303 was clearly very well designed, as it should have been given that Grumman had built the Jaguar, then the F-111B. Their experience came through. But given their early start, serious competition from Grumman was expected to come from LTV. The 505 was in some ways more radical than the 303, but not in areas like the engine location and the fuselage aerodynamics, and those would be decisive in the end. 505 evolved into 507, which was a remarkable aircraft. It was the result of an agreement LTV made with Lockheed to cover the anticipated USAF VX and Navy VFX procurements. Although out of the fighter game since the Starfighter, Lockheed was still a serious player, and they possessed extensive knowledge of how to use large amounts of titanium in an aircraft structure. Then, in 1968, LTV agreed a cooperation agreement with Dassault. This was very important for VFX, as Dassault had decent experience of variable geometry wings via the experimental Mirage 3G. Their F1 was a lighter, less sophisticated aircraft than VFX, but it was also innovative in its own right. LTV rapidly integrated the newfound intellectual property into the foundational design of the 505. The intake shape, for example, is pure Mirage. The cockpit fairing somewhere between the 505 and the F1. The tail is, however, very Vought in that it is mounted on a radical anhedral. It's a lovely looking aircraft which LTV worked up into a full-size mock-up and had high hopes for. At combat weight, it weighed just under £50,000 and was capable of lifting £15,400 of internal fuel, a couple of 450-gallon drop tanks, and 6 Phoenixes for a cap weight of £57,400. Sidewinders were carried in a Crusader-style twin mount below the cockpit on the forward fuselage. The M61 was mounted in the right side intake duct fairing, and LTV continued to make a lot of its multi-role potential. It could carry 15 Snake Eyes on an interdiction mission. Overall, the 507 looked like a serious competitor. The issues were the relative narrowness of the fuselage, the low-set canopy that was more redolent of an interceptor than a fighter, and the tight packaging of the engines in the rear fuselage. The pictures make it look like quite a compact aircraft, but in fact it was just a shade under 70 feet long. That length was also a crucial problem, despite the ability to pack and fold the wings in a rather innovative fashion. McDonnell Douglas entry therefore ended up being Grumman's stiffest competition. Model 225 was an evolution of the 222, development of which had begun in 1967. 225 had a low-mounted variable sweep wing, twin tails, and small fold-down canards on the front of the intake boxes. These were used for trimming the aircraft when it was at high speeds, with the wings all the way back. The cockpit was high-mounted and featured a proper fighter-style bubble. 225 was in theory the fastest of the 5 designs. 40% of the airframe weight was in titanium, giving it the heat resistance to hit Mach 3 once the follow-on engines were installed. 6 cavities were set into the belly, each of which could accommodate a Phoenix or a Sparrow or air-to-ground munitions. If a gun was needed, it was installed on the front centerline cavity, a feature that enabled the aircraft to carry the desired 6 missiles at reduced total weight. Up to 4 sidewinders could be carried, 2 under the wing shoulders and 2 on stub pylons under the fuselage. In reality, at least one of these pairs would have been used for tanks. In cap trim with Phoenix and tanks, it tipped the scales at £57,900. Incidentally, in the early 1970s, after Grumman had been selected, McDonnell Douglas proposed a navalized F-15 as an alternative to the F-14, which was still suffering development issues. F-15N was a truly interesting fighter. If the Phoenix requirement had been taken away, then it might have been an enduringly powerful part of the carrier air group. But adding in £10,000 of Org-9 and Phoenix-related paraphernalia blunted performance, and eventually the idea died. General Dynamics entry, the Model 44, shows the strong influence of the F-111. It is quite a conventional entry, to be honest. Like the McDonnell Douglas design, Model 44 has a palletized M61 Vulcan, but this one was mounted in the recess between the forward 2 Sparrows. Like the Grumman entry, it had a glove flap on the leading edge of the fixed portion of the wing to provide increased lift. The aircraft generally looks a bit like the back half of an F-111 with some form of proto F-14 stuck on the front. It was a relatively heavy aircraft at nearly £56,000 in fighter configuration and £69,000 fully loaded. That doesn't seem so bad until you realise that Model 44 was designed around Sparrow, not Phoenix. In general, the Model 44, which was developed by the Convair division, just doesn't seem like a particularly serious effort. Perhaps General Dynamics recognised that they were unlikely to beat Grumman in the competition. The final competitor for VFX was North American Rockwell. Their NA323 appears to have been a largely clean sheet design. It was based around a high-mounted fixed geometry wing with an elegant curved leading edge and prominent leading edge extensions. Intakes were sharply angled boxes, presumably based on the extensive research on high-speed intakes that North American Rockwell had done in and around the Valkyrie program. The 323 really is quite a radical departure from the VFX formula. From the side, it looks like a proto-Eurofighter. In plan form, it looks kind of like a flanker. It was 62 feet long with a 58-foot wingspan and a massive 650 square foot wing area, which is bigger than the 600 square feet of the F-15, although that aircraft probably has greater lift from the fuselage than the relatively narrow 323. Although it could apparently carry Phoenix, pictures tend to show Sparrows, and that nose looks a bit small for a 36-inch dish. A full-size mock-up was constructed, which makes it a bit odd that so little is now known about the 323. Between October and December 1968, the Navy engaged in a very rigorous assessment of the designs. Naval Air Systems Command led the evaluation. Congress was breathing down their neck, wanting to avoid another vast waste of money like the F-111B. The Navy also asked NASA at Langley to test the aircraft designs in their wind tunnel and to render their verdict. The standard of the entries was judged to be impressively high, but two immediately stood out. On December the 17th, McDonnell Douglas and Grumman's entries were taken forward for final evaluations, and the other companies were stood down. On the 14th of January, Grumman were declared the winners. NASA's evaluation matched the Navy's assessment, which prevented any dispute from Congress. A contract for 6 development aircraft was signed on the 3rd of February. The only change that the Navy insisted on was the switch to a twin tail. With one tail on each engine nacelle, the folding ventral strake was removed and replaced with smaller fixed fins, one on the underside of each nacelle. Although this change increased the weight of the tail structures, it simplified the rear airframe and the weight dedicated to ventral strakes for an overall reduction. It also reduced the aircraft's visual signature. Any reduction must be weighed against the F-14's generally large size. It isn't exactly a difficult aircraft to see. VFX was thus a very quick process to conclude a procurement exercise that had taken the best part of a decade thus far. The Navy had learned some very hard lessons along the way, building on previous issues they'd encountered with the Jaguar and the F-111 from a variable sweep architecture perspective, from the experience of F-4 crews in Vietnam, and from the Missileer and F-111 again with respect to radar and missiles. VFAX also allowed useful hypotheses to be developed, allowing for a clear set of requirements. It also helped that Grumman showed up with their best game and clearly beat the other potential suppliers. There was no F-111 style appeal and no McNamara to overrule. Unfortunately, the development of the F-14 from the G303E was far from smooth. But that's another story.